everyone for joining us today. International attention, sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm John Wuthnow, and I'm China Program Manager and Editor-in-Chief of China Brief at the Jamestown Foundation. International attention is rightfully focused on the horrifying situation unfolding in Ukraine. But the Indo-Pacific region is hardly static either. Today, we're going to discuss one of the main fault lines in the region, which is the long-running boundary dispute between China and India. Since the 2020 Galwan Valley clash that killed 20 Indian soldiers and an unverified number of PLA troops, India and China have had multiple rounds of border talks, but have failed to make much headway in reducing tensions along the line of actual control, the de facto boundary. There has also not been the same level of leader-level engagement between Presidents Xi Jinping and President Modi that helped lower the temperature following the 2017 Tri-Junction Dockland standoff. So as we head into 2022, the key question is, can a modus vivendi of sorts be reached, or will the border confrontation between China and India intensify? We've got an excellent panel of experts here with us today, and I want to specifically thank the two experts that we have joining us from India. It's the evening there, and they've taken time out of their schedule to share their insights. We have Dr. Jagannath Panda, who's a research fellow and center coordinator at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. We have Dr. Sudha Ramachandran. She's an independent researcher and journalist based in Bangalore, India. And finally, we have Dr. Wuthnow, who's a senior research fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs at the US National Defense University. We had originally planned to have Jagannath go first, but we decided because we're having some internet connectivity issues, we're going to start with Sudha, who's going to actually take us through some of the talks, the military level talks, to try to reduce tensions at the border. And then we'll zoom out and we'll go to Jagannath, who's going to give us an overview of the security situation. And finally, we'll go to Joel, who's going to talk us through the role of the People's Liberation Army and the People's Armed Police in the current dispute. So Sudha, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights today.
Thank you so much, John, for inviting me to this to participate in this panel. I'll be giving you all a quick overview of what is happening at the military, at the talks between the corps commanders of the Indian and the Chinese armies. And then, of course, discuss a little about what success has been achieved and what hasn't. So far, it's 22 months since India slowly started waking up to the fact that Chinese troops had ingressed into territory that was under Indian control. 14 rounds of talks have taken place so far, and with regard to the friction points, that is, these friction points, it's really Indian euphemism for those areas where the Chinese troops have ingressed into territory on the Indian side of the LAC. So, so there are several friction points in Ladakh, and so far, disengagement is said to have been achieved at Galwan, where there was a bloody clash in June 2020. Gogra, and from the north bank of the Pangong So, which is a lake. Hot Springs and Depsang and Demchok. These, the disengagement, there's been no agreement yet on these, at these friction points. So Over the months, of course, both sides have built up their troop deployment as well as their deployment stationing of military hardware. Both have been beefing up their infrastructure on either sides of the LAC. An important development that has happened is that China has constructed a bridge across the north and south banks of the Pangong Tso, which will drastically shorten the time taken for it to, to transport its troops from the north bank to the south bank. And this bridge is about 25 kilometers from the LAC. Also, you find that China is applying pressure on India at other points, at other sectors in the LAC. An important point has been at Barakoti in the middle sector in Uttarakhand. So here it did attempt to, or it sent its troops across the LAC into territory held by India. These troops, about 100 troops, Chinese troops, entered India, stayed here for about 3 hours, and damaged infrastructure and went. So it was an important, a significant incursion that took place. Then, of course, you also have the land border law that China has enacted. I'm just giving you a few points about the background against which the border talks are happening. Then, of course, China has announced Chinese names for several places on the Indian side of the LOC in Arunachal Pradesh, and this is the eastern sector. And then, of course, Ukraine. So this is certainly going to be a big influence on the talks and what they can achieve in 2022. Now, as I said, 14 rounds have taken place, and the 14th round, while there was no breakthrough and the logjam over hot springs was not broken, yet it was sort of compared to the 13th round of the talks, this was seen to be, a step forward. So this shows really how, how small the steps are, when progress is made, how small these steps forward are. And so in the 14th round of talks, for instance, although there was no forward movement on the question of disengagement, simply the fact that the two issued a joint statement, and where both sides were, there were many positive words about continuing the talks and keeping in contact. So all these were sort of heralded by the media on both sides as steps forward. And this is especially in comparison to the 13th round, where the two, the 13th round of talks took place in, I think, around October, and it ended in recriminations. Both sides issued statements in which there were strong words criticizing the other side. So compared to the mess at the end of the 13th round, the 14th round seemed a bit of a success. Now, of course, so in the 14th round, as I said, so now we have hot springs, which hasn't yet, no disengagement has taken place there, and Depsang as well as Demchok. And there are some worrying developments with regard to these, because China, for one, apparently is unwilling to even discuss disengagement of troops from Depsang, and I'll deal with that in a little more detail in a bit. So if more breakthroughs haven't happened, of course, India would like to see it as that China is is not giving in and is unwilling to even discuss Depsang. Or you sometimes hear officials saying that that they are unhelpful, and they don't even put forward helpful ideas on how to move forward. But I think an important reason why I would say that things are not going well for India is that the Indian government itself is undermining its position at the negotiating table. And this is largely because the Indian Prime Minister and the ruling party, while it has been extremely muscular in its rhetoric, especially with regard to Pakistan, when it comes to China, you know, it's of course been a lot more silent, parsimonious with the truth, and has even simply denied the seriousness of the Chinese threat at the border. Now, the Narendra Modi government seems more concerned about the domestic ramifications of what is happening at the border rather than the fact that India is losing territory along the LAC. Now, this of course started early, from to 2020, for several weeks, although there were reports and analyses in the media about these Chinese intrusions, the army chief and several others in the government simply denied it. Even after Galwan, the clashes at Galwan took place, the Prime Minister at an all-party meeting said he simply denied that there were clashes or that the Chinese had intruded. And I quote him here, he said, "China has neither intruded into our border, nor has any post been taken over by them." So in effect, what he did was really to weaken India's hand in future negotiations. I mean, he was really saying what the Chinese were saying, that they had not intruded into India, to the Indian side of the LOC. Then, of course, again, when the Chinese troops, and I just talked to you all about that, that is at Barahoti, when 100 troops came into the Indian LAC, on the Indian side of the LAC, India did nothing about it. The troops didn't push back the Chinese troops. So it's almost as though India doesn't want to confront the Chinese, or is simply too scared of the repercussions. Then you find that at the talks, apparently, at the military talks, in areas where some disengagement has been, agreements have been reached, you find that the two sides have agreed on a buffer zone, a no patrolling buffer zone. But these buffer zones apparently are going against India's interests, in that they are eating into territory that was formerly under Indian control. Okay. So these buffer zones seem to be more in Indian controlled territory than in Chinese territory. And, for one example is that at Galwan, for instance, the LAC the buffer zone seem to have been drawn 1 kilometer in favor of China. Okay, so in order to secure a disengagement from the Chinese, India seems to be conceding more than what it is getting out of the Chinese. Then you also find that China, again, to secure Chinese disengagement from the northern bank of the Pangong Tso, India, handed over or handed back control over the Kailash Heights. Now, this was, I would say this has been described as India's sole bargaining chip. This Kailash Heights is the only territory that India managed to take control of over the last 2 years, which was under Chinese control. Rather than hold on to this bargaining chip for a later stage, India's, almost surrendered this bargaining chip early, so that it could get the Chinese to hand over and, disengage from the northern bank. Analysts are now saying that particularly worrying is India's very, unclear position on Depsang. Now, Depsang is highly strategic territory to India. It is a point at which these are plains in an area which is very mountainous. It is Depsang lies to the east of the Siachen, to the south of the Karakoram Pass to the west of Aksai. So, and this was under India's control. And increasingly, India seems to be, doesn't want, it knows that the Chinese are not going to discuss this, and is denying that this is a recent issue. So recently, the Indian Army chief said that out of 5 or 6 friction points, 5 have been resolved. Now, if he means that only 1 remains unresolved, and this is hot springs, then is he denying that Depsang is a friction area? Now, this has been raised by several analysts, and this is worrying because India is, in 2020, the Chinese did take control and, block off Indian troops from the Y junction at Depsang. But increasingly, you find, the Indian officials not talking or not wanting to talk about Depsang as as being part of the current crisis as well. So, so as you can see, things haven't been going too well for India at the LAC. And looking forward, I fear that things are going to remain difficult or get more difficult, especially in the context of what is happening, the Ukraine crisis. I see China as having benefited the most, or likely to benefit the most from the conflict over the Ukraine. And so, while the world's attention is on Ukraine and Eastern Europe, the possibility of China nibbling at territory in the LAC cannot be ruled out. And also, India's whatever the defense equipment that it would have expected or was expecting from Russia, this is likely to, delivery of these of this hardware is likely to slow down, and as the conflict, as the Ukraine conflict, if it turns out to be a prolonged conflict, then Russia's dependence on China will grow, which means that the likelihood of Russia either being neutral or supporting India seems rather bleak. So as things stand, I would say that looking ahead into this year, I would say that things are not looking good for India. Thank you.
Sudha, thank you so much for those incisive points. We're now going to turn to Jagannath, who's going to explain sort of how we got here with the security situation and where it may go from here. Jagannath, over to you.
Thank you, John. Am I audible? Thank you. Thank you, Jamestown Foundation, for this panel. It's excellent to be here with Joel and Sudha. And John, I think you have set the ground at the outset. You mentioned the political deadlock that is there between both the sides. And I think we need to understand the background, the big picture, how we have arrived here and what are the reasons. So in 10 minutes, let me address 3 specific questions. One is what has really triggered this boundary dispute to intensify so much? And why has it really intensified and not really coming down? And I think that is one critical question we need to really understand. The second is that what is the current state of affairs? And third, how is it really looking into the future? Are we really anticipating something like a Galwan is going to re-emerge in different sectors, in other sectors, like in the middle sector or in the eastern sector? Or how is it really going to pan out? And I think the first question is, what has really triggered the boundary dispute in last couple of years or 3-4 years? And I think the conventional argument, and many analysts have made this point, that I think it is the perceptual difference on the line of actual control that has actually led to this situation. But if we see the situation that has unfolded over the last 3 to 4 years carefully, particularly from the Galwan Valley incident in 2017-18 onwards, I think there are more into it. Lack of clarification in the line of actual control was always a factor between China and India since 1962 war. In fact, prior to 1962 war also, there was always a lack of clarification on the line of actual control. So we need to ask that all these years, over the last 5 to 6 decades, there was always a lack of clarification on the line of actual control. Now, why the line of actual control is becoming such an intensified issue in today's context? And I think if we see clinically, there are 2 specific issues that has actually contributed to this boundary dispute to intensify, and both sides, and particularly China, has made a capital out of it by saying that it is the lack of clarification in the line of actual control that has triggered the boundary dispute and intensified so much. The first reason is, I think there is an intensification of nationalist outlook in both China and India. And I think that is one of the prime reasons why both China and India have come so close on the to fight another war or a mini-scale war on the Galwan Valley. And I think if we see from the Chinese side, it is the nationalist process that is taking place within China. We have seen the new Coast Guard law, we have seen the new border law, we have seen a kind of economic and security cover-up, which is actually strengthening the Chinese state process, that is the dual circulation strategy of China. So all of these factors are somehow directly or indirectly linked with a nationalist outlook process, and where PLA is playing a significant role in terms of building a nationalist outlook for China. If we try to also understand from Indian point of view, I think a number of regions, number of developments that has actually annoyed China, and that's why China has become so aggressive and maintained an assertive posture towards India in last few years. One is the main reason is the re-evocation of Article 370 in the Jammu and Kashmir. The Modi government is a strong nationalist government in India, and the decision to re-invoke the Article 370 and trying to dismantle the autonomy part which was attached to Jammu and Kashmir all this while, try to diminish, try to finish it, and try to give a special outlook to the Jammu and Kashmir as a sovereign state, has actually triggered the Chinese outlook towards India, and the Chinese have actually been annoyed about this. And this was one of the significant development from Indian side after the Galwan incident, which has actually upset the Chinese. The second thing is, I think, the Quad process. The Chinese have actually seen the Quad process as a kind of India's more pointed alignment strategy, more security and military oriented partnership with the US, with Japan, with Australia, in a negative context. So the Quad and India's embrace to the Indo-Pacific politics has actually, annoyed the Chinese, and that has also contributed to the boundary dispute. And I think third factor is the economic part of this logic, which is the new supply chain resilience initiatives. If we see during the pandemic, after the Galwan incident, and also slightly before that, the China's economic strategy was started being questioned. And therefore, India has actually taken the lead in terms of banning the Chinese applications, Chinese apps after the Galwan incident and during the pandemic. And also India has tied up with Australia and Japan in terms of forming a new supply chain resilience initiatives. So all of these issues are nationalist issues that has actually triggered and contributed to the boundary dispute. And therefore, we do see a much more assertive China and much more stronger and resilient India confronting with China. The second factor here, what we need to also understand, the personality-driven foreign policy image of China and India. We know for a fact, I think, that Xi Jinping has been a strong leader. He has, amended the Chinese constitution. He has made a case for himself after Mao Zedong that he is such a tall leader. And I think at some point, the Chinese state, the Chinese authorities, officials have also equally seen Modi as a clashing personality and posing a challenge to Xi Jinping's leadership in Asia and in the larger scale of Indo-Pacific and in world politics from Asia. And I think even though we know for a fact that there was an informal summit, as you rightly mentioned, John, that between Modi and Xi Jinping, at one point it looked like this personal chemistry between the two leaders would probably maintain a kind of peace and stability in India-China relations. But eventually, what we saw, a clash of personality. So the personality-driven foreign policy image of China and India is a crucial factor which has actually contributed to the China-India boundary dispute. Now, my second question, what is the current state of affairs now? And I think the current state of affairs is not really positive, not really conducive, not really conducive. As Sudha actually pointed out rightly, is that, and I don't really see a much more a stable relationship emerging between India and China when we see the boundary dispute. And I think 3-4 points needs to be mentioned here. One is, I think, what we are currently seeing, there is a continuous effort by the Chinese side to make a ground or to make a case for the new territorial claims. It has been started for last few years. We have seen in 2014, when actually Xi Jinping came to power and Modi actually came to power, those were the initial period when we saw an incident in Chumar happening when Xi Jinping was actually visiting India in 2014. So since that time, the Chinese are trying to make a capital out of every incident, trying to claim new territories, new lands. So we are seeing a pattern of new territorial claims by China. On the other hand, from India's point of view, we are seeing India carrying out massive infrastructure developmental programs. For example, we are now having Bharatmala projects, which is a road and infrastructure developmental program in order to bring out good civilian and military infrastructure in the northern border of India, be it with China, be it with the Pakistan, just to cover India's security. India is also bringing out first-scale infrastructure development. Now, if we see the second point here, which needs to be also mentioned, is that there are 3 specific levels of dialogues or talks going on to dispute, to find a stable scenario for the boundary dispute. One is the special representative level mechanisms dialogue, which is actually to resolve the boundary dispute between the two countries, and it is not going anywhere. Second, there is a mechanism called working mechanisms for coordination and consultations, which is actually going to look at the bordering regions and border affairs. It is also failing to manage the tensions. Third, the Corps commander level, which actually held the 14th round of talk. Now, these 3 rounds of dialogue mechanisms is not really working out. That means what we will see that the negotiation process is getting derailed. There is no hopes to find a resolutions, and these mechanisms are failing. And in top of that, what we are seeing, Chinese are coming out with much more aggressive, posturing. The role of state to protect sovereignty has increased after the new land law has been introduced. There is a special role for the PLA and TAP, we can see, which are both actually under the command of the CMC under the leadership of Xi Jinping. Third, there is a civil military fusion strategies emerging from the Chinese side. And all of this actually intensified intensifying the bordering regions. And from India's side, what we are seeing, after the establishment of Chief of Defense Staff, CDS office in India's military structure, the Chinese have been very, very particular about India on the boundaries. My last point and the third question, what is the future of this dispute? And what impact the current Ukraine and Russia crisis or war will have on China-India relations? I think if we see the Ukraine and Russia tensions, it will have some impact on China-India boundary dispute, primarily because it has been a tactical understanding between Xi Jinping and Putin, between Russia and China, to support each other on sovereignty issues, on territorial matters, on maritime issues, or on matters of national security importance. And I think to that effect, I think why Xi Jinping is becoming silent on the Ukraine and Russia incident needs to be understood, because at some stage, Xi Jinping would be needing the Russian support, not only in the UN, but also outside the UN, in terms of when it comes to South China Sea, when it comes to Taiwan issue, when it comes to China-India boundary dispute. Even though we are not really comparing, the Ukraine crisis with all of these territorial and maritime disputes, but there is a clear linkages because it's a matter of sovereignty and territorial integrity as far as China is concerned. So therefore, when we look at the future of the China-India boundary dispute, there is no immediate solution to this dispute. The negotiation pattern, the mechanisms are not really working. They are completely derailed. The 20th National Party Congress in 2022 of China would add probably more nationalist-oriented objectives from the Chinese side. And when we try to understand from India's side, India will continue to have an anti-China foreign policy. So therefore, I am not really very optimistic about China-India boundary dispute resolving anytime soon. And also China-India relations will not return to normalcy in near future, in my opinion. I'll stop here and probably invite some comments and questions whenever there is a discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jagannath, for that excellent overview. Let's turn now to Joel, who's we got a bit of a preview, who's going to talk us through the role of the People's Liberation Army and People's Armed Police. Joel, over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, John. Thanks to Jamestown for inviting me to participate this morning amidst other notable global events at present. Well, let me start by kind of discussing or sketching China's military posture in Western China and with respect to the border dispute with India. And then after I do that, I'm going to make three kind of broader comments about China, about China's military strategy, and also about Chinese military modernization and reform that I think provide needed context to understand China's posture and also its decision-making with respect to the Indian border issue. So first of all, with respect to sort of the immediate military posture, we're talking here about China's Western Theater Command. This is the largest, geographically, this is the largest of China's 5 theaters. It is one of its most important contingencies, is a border flare-up with India, but that's not all it's preparing to do. This is a theater that is also responsible for the border situation with Afghanistan, which has also heated up lately. This is the theater that deals with cross-border problems, drug trades, and human trafficking, et cetera, insurgencies, and so on in Central Asia. And most notably, it deals with internal unrest in Xinjiang and Tibet, and needs to be prepared to address domestic issues. So it's a competent theater. They don't necessarily have more or better equipment than any other part of the PLA, but they do have some specialized equipment for these sorts of contingencies. They have 3 group armies. They have 2 military districts, 3 Air Force bases, a rocket force base, and significant People's Armed Police assets that are mainly focused on those internal unrest scenarios in Western China. So they have a lot to do. Now, if we turn specifically to the border with India, and I'll focus here just on the Aksai Chin region there in the Western sector, Chinese forces that are forward deployed there are arrayed, roughly speaking, along a 200-mile front or so on. They have mostly battalion and smaller sized formations and encampments in specific parts of this front, mostly valleys and other areas. Some heavy equipment located As Sudha mentioned earlier, they've been in the process of building important military infrastructure in the region, including roads and bridges, military buildings, missile defense systems, in fact, other kinds of infrastructure that would be useful for prosecuting a larger contingency. That being said, at present, Chinese PLA units are spread out relatively vastly across unfavorable and difficult terrain. They don't have a lot of capacity for mutual support between these different spread out units. And so sort of the conclusion that we draw is that primarily what they're doing is they are sort of defensive oriented. They are doing probing. They are doing kind of small scale provocations and patrols and this sort of thing, but they aren't postured necessarily for large scale combined arms or joint operations of the kind that we saw in 1962. So that's sort of the immediate near term posture. Now, kind of three larger areas of context to kind of make sense and contextualize some of this development. So first of all, in respect to Chinese border and territorial disputes writ large, I think what we've seen over the last dozen years has been an uptick of military assertiveness. That's been sort of the buzzwords that's been used. This started before Xi Jinping came in, I think amplified or accelerated after Xi Jinping arrived in office and gained steam, partly due to his worldview, growing capabilities, and to some degree, perhaps the posture of some of the other regional opponents. But this has been going on for quite some time, especially over the last 2 years during the global pandemic. We saw a particular uptick of Chinese sort of aggressive or assertive behavior across the full sweep of territorial disputes, not just with India. We have seen, for instance, more steady patrols in the South China Sea, more willingness to use low levels of coercion. In the East China Sea, we've seen a stronger number of Chinese patrols there. Certainly across the Taiwan Strait, we've seen a very significant uptick of Chinese coercive activities. And also with India, of course, beginning in the May-June 2020 timeframe in the Galwan Valley, we saw. And so this isn't just confined to India. This is sort of a general tendency that's going on here. During the pandemic, I think what we saw initially was a desire to deter other regional antagonists, to say, look, we will not permit other countries to take advantage of us when we are distracted internally. As the pandemic moved on and other countries were affected, I think we saw a Chinese opportunism in saying, look, we have a strategic design. We are going to do certain things that while other countries are perhaps distracted or weak, to expand our military capabilities and posture. And to take advantage of the situation. Also, there's a domestic piece as well. The nationalistic piece that Jagannath mentioned, I think, is very much present in the Xi Jinping era, and especially during the pandemic, when it's useful to draw on nationalism when the domestic public isn't necessarily all that satisfied with the government's response to a major internal crisis. All right, that being said, China has not shown itself willing to escalate any of these disputes really to a high level or to the level of warfare. The Galwan Valley incident in June 2020 was really the single exception where lethal force was used, but at a small scale and in ambiguous circumstances. We don't see a general tendency to increase escalation. And the reason, of course, is that China has other considerations that it has to pay attention to, even while it's trying to secure its border interests and deter and intimidate other opponents. And so, China does not demand a rupture. It doesn't seek a rupture with any of its neighbors. These are all economic partners, to some degree, geopolitical partners. China, I think, to some degree, desires not to have India fall fully into a U.S. strategic orbit and wants to have, positive relations go on there. And so, ratcheting up tensions to the level of lethal violence will really cut against that other strategic agenda that is happening in China. So we've seen somewhat of a balancing act, but leaning more towards risk-taking and assertiveness. The second piece of context I'll mention here has to do with China's military strategy writ large. And so China's strategy is updated periodically. Most recently, at the beginning of 2019, they issued a new set of strategic guidelines for the PLA. A lot of consistency with the past in terms of sort of the main areas that they're focused on, major antagonists. The Sino-Indian border in this context is not the primary theater for the PLA. They have remained focused very much on the southeast with Taiwan, the United States, and stretching into the Western Pacific. That's really their primary contingency. India and the border issue is what they would regard as a secondary strategic direction, meaning that it's not unimportant, but it's relatively less important than the primary theater. And so in the secondary strategic directions, such as the Indian border, the North Korean border, the South China Sea, they need to be able to deter other opponents and be able to escalate, but this is not where they're putting the majority of their planning effort and necessarily their best capabilities. So there's clearly a force planning dilemma here for the PLA. They need to develop in the Himalayas specialized capabilities that are not easily transferable to other theaters. And you cannot just take an amphibious brigade on the southeast coast and use that in the Himalayas. I mean, so there's not a perfect fungibility of these forces across theaters. And so this creates a planning dilemma for the PLA. And then the other sort of dilemma they face is what would happen in a crisis over Taiwan. And there's a strain of thinking in China that other antagonists, including India, might opportunistically seize a crisis on China's east coast to reclaim lost territory or enforce territorial claims. And so China needs to maintain a very good deterrent posture in these other theaters to safeguard or to prevent other antagonists from taking advantage of a major crisis on China's east coast. All right, and well, the last piece of context that I'll mention here has to do with sort of the overall trajectory of Chinese military modernization and reform. I think as we're all familiar now, we're now 5 years deep into a major overhaul of the PLA that has been personally led by Xi Jinping. Relevant to this particular contingency, the establishment of the theater structure is very important because it focuses the PLA on joint operations and joint campaigns. And so, how do you achieve synergies between land and air, in this context, forces and conventional missile forces? And so the command and control structure is much better postured to be able to plan for and envision a larger contingency than the previous structure that was very much service oriented. The Western Theater Command, I'll just note briefly here, is a land theater. It does not have a navy. And so if there were a larger struggle with India along multiple fronts, perhaps a border dispute plus a conflict in the Indian Ocean, then China's theater system isn't particularly well optimized for that, and they would have to involve multiple theaters for it. In terms of capabilities, over the last 5 years, we've seen the advent of a new generation of many different kinds of important PLA capabilities, including long-range precision fires, including new fighters, main battle tanks, and so on. And so the PLA is really trying to upgrade its equipment, and a lot of this stuff would potentially be pretty useful for both for deterrent purposes and also for sort of strategic projection operations across contested borders. PLA reform, however, has not been a complete success story. There are a number of missing parts of this that I think that they will be continuing to work on over the next 5 years as they dig into the 14th five-year plan. And so, just a few areas worth noting here that are relevant to the Indian and the border contingency. Number one, in terms of PLA doctrine, PLA sort of operational doctrine hasn't been updated for almost 20 years. In late 2020, they started the process of finally starting to revisit their operational doctrine. And so now I think we're getting into updated, revised doctrine for things like what they would call joint border defense campaigns and joint anti-air raid campaigns and things of this nature that are relevant to the Sino-Indian border. But as far as I know, none of that has actually been formally approved or authorized yet. And doctrine, of course, is having that being instituted in terms of PLA training, force structure, and education. This is very, very important for them. In terms of personnel, this is another area where they have repeatedly criticized themselves for lacking highly competent operational commanders, lacking realistic training, lacking systems to develop folks in the senior leadership of the PLA without any combat experience. And in the Western Theater Command in particular, there's been a fairly high turnover of senior leadership for reasons that remain somewhat ambiguous, but that some have suggested reflect less confidence perhaps among Xi and his advisors in that particular leadership. And then finally, I'll talk just a little bit here about logistics. China has undergone a fairly significant reform to its logistics apparatus, and yet this is a very new and currently under revision part of the PLA. As we've seen over the last week or so in Ukraine, logistics support, especially across borders where you're operating quite far from your interior lines, is very difficult and somewhat easy to underappreciate. And so China, I think, has been taking the logistics question seriously, and yet the new Joint Logistics Force has no operational experience to speak of outside of a pandemic response. And their relationship with the theater commands is fairly loose and fairly weak. And so if China were to anticipate a broader campaign across the border, and to sustain it, I think that would be very difficult and potentially a weakness that they would need to wrap their heads around. So just to conclude here, I think the bottom line here is that number one, China has a formidable posture in the Himalayas. They've been increasing it over the last few years with infrastructure, with troop deployments and so on. That being said, they have a lot to worry about in this part of the country, and they're not just simply focusing on one particular problem, and nationwide they have other things that are of a higher priority for them. It would be hard for them to pivot from the small scale engagements and operations and patrols that we've seen of late to larger scale operations. Not impossible, but it would take them some time to be able to do that. Over the longer term, I think we can't rule out a larger sort of a la 1962 use of force, but it doesn't seem likely for many different reasons, both on the military side and on the political decision making side. And so I agree with the preceding speakers that the future doesn't look particularly promising in terms of resolving the dispute, but in terms of escalating to a very high level of violence from the Chinese side, even with the distraction of Ukraine and so on. I don't anticipate a large scale use of force in the next year or two, and a lot would have to change in terms of the PLA and in terms of Chinese decision making after the Party Congress, I think, to get there. All right, so let me stop there and invite questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. That's a really good segue, and just a quick housekeeping note that you can type in questions in the chat box or raise your hand to ask a question in person. As we kind of wait for questions to come in, I want to kind of piggyback on Joel's last point, which is, can the border relationship or the border dispute be separated from the larger relationship? So I think last year, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, the border dispute has to be put in its place. But Indian Minister of External Affairs Jaishankar has said, no, it can't be separated from the broader dispute. But in the past, we've seen China and India be able to work through the border dispute and have a working relationship. So it'd be interesting to hear, I guess, maybe from you, Sudha, and you, or all the panelists, what you think, if it's possible to do that. I think China, on some level, may be hoping to do just that. Sudha, you're muted. Oh, there we go. I guess, Jagannath, can we go to you and then we'll unmute Sudha? Sorry about that.
Yes, I think it will be very difficult from India's point of view to disassociate the boundary dispute from the larger picture of India-China relations. And I think recently we saw that Indian diplomats boycotting the Beijing Winter Olympics, primarily because the soldier who was fighting the conflict in Galwan Valley, it was carrying the torch during the Beijing Winter Olympics. So I think that signals that India is getting its note in order not to really engage with China in a holistic manner. Earlier, the way earlier India used to disassociate the boundary dispute and try to frame India-China relations in a larger context, I think the current government's approach is not to really dissuade. So therefore, what we are seeing a much more harder nationalist position from India's point of view, not to compromise, make China realize that India is the largest neighbor of China and India is a responsible country here, which should not be ill-treated. And I think that's the message from the current government in Delhi going to Beijing. And therefore, I don't really see the negotiation process would also overlook to make any compromise as far as the larger issues are concerned. In fact, during the 14th round of commander level dialogue, there was a discussion that, let's keep the momentum going about the negotiation and try to promote the India-China relations and bring back to normalcy. But I think the soldiers on the ground, the negotiators on the ground also realize that this problem is much more complex and it cannot be disassociated. And therefore, India is getting much more nationalist and passing a strong signal to China that no matter what comes, the boundary dispute has to be addressed on a priority, and then we'll move ahead in terms of promoting peace and stability in India-China ties.
Sudha?
Yeah. I think India may want to, integrate all parts of the relationship, but the reality is that it is very difficult given India's huge trade and economic relationship with China. The fact is that even at the height of these tensions, trade has been booming and has in fact increased last year.
Great.
And John, I suppose if I can just follow, I can completely agree with both Sudha and Jagannath in terms of you cannot disconnect the border dispute from larger relations. But I think the rub for China really is that there's a tension on the one hand between being seen internally to be doing something, across different border disputes and responding to perceived provocations and setting up for potential future military operations. And so there is a motive to do this, which is fairly damaging, I think, to China's relations with India on one hand, and yet on the other hand, to try to maintain a fairly, at least a functional and working relationship with New Delhi to, among other things, to counter the U.S. strategy in Asia, for instance, by not aligning too closely. My perspective, though, is that China has really emphasized the former at the expense of the latter. And what we've seen really is, over the last couple of years, India moving quite strongly towards, really from the perspective of 2 or 3 years ago, unimaginable support for the Quad and defense cooperation with the U.S. And a lot of that, frankly, has been driven exactly by China's more provocative behavior on the border. And so China, we would use the aphorism sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul over this, and it's a question of, do they realize that they've made this choice, or are they so, to quote Lutwick, strategically autistic and not really understanding the full, degree of the damage they've actually been doing by escalating these disputes?
Yeah, that's such a great point. I'm thinking about the kind of, because it's perplexing, right? I think for us in Washington, you would think China's always talking about a multipolar world, right? And you would think that they would, they had BRICS with India, they still have BRICS, right? And you would think that they would not want to kind of, subjugate these kind of that broader strategic aim to those kind of domestic drivers that you're talking about, Joel. And I've heard, people like Dr. Fravel at MIT, try to explain it, as China's sovereignty obsession, et cetera, and not to kind of wander too much, but I'm thinking about the longstanding China-Russia dispute, border dispute, which was settled in 2004, where China did make compromises, and I think they subordinated those border claims and some of their orthodoxy over sovereignty to the broader goal of fostering a strategic relationship with Russia, and it's interesting we're not seeing a comparable effort with India, and I'm struggling to figure out why that is, I guess. So. Looks like, unfortunately, we've lost Sudha. I know she had been having, oh, here she's coming back.
John, you wanted me to add something to the discussion, the points that both you and Joel mentioned?
Please.
I think one more factor also, we need to look at it very closely. I think it is also much more linked to China's economic strength. I mean, of course, from 2012 onwards, what we see a kind of a new normal tag they are trying to promote, that, you know, the Chinese economy is not under crisis. And even though we would believe them that then they are not in crisis, but one point is that I think their economy is under stress. The coastal regions is not really giving the return to the overall Chinese economic architecture the way earlier the coastal economies used to give and offer over the last 15 or 20 years. And I think that is another region, maybe a background region, which has contributed the Chinese leadership to look at some of these security and sovereignty issues in a new way. A new way, not necessarily going for a full-scale war, but to also create a nationalist-oriented, environment within China, so that the attention of the Chinese people will go to the other direction, to the national security line thinking, instead of really trying to question the Chinese Communist Party about the economic development. One more point also, this is a larger global point, and I don't necessarily try to link both these points, but this is a separate point. And I think also what we need to understand from India's point of view, there was a period from the beginning of 21st century, let's say from 2004 or 5 onwards, India was very keen to promote a multilateral oriented relations with China. And after that, immediately what we saw during Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's regimes, India actually sided with China in terms of supporting a lot of multilateral associations, be it BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa Association, or, you know, after that, Russia, India, China, trilateral, which was actually flourishing. And then eventually we saw India supporting AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So all of these things suggested that India was quite open to have a much more global oriented multilateral partnership with China, and try not to really go entirely with the US way. But I think since Xi Jinping has come to power, the way Xi Jinping's foreign policy approach has been towards India, India is reviewing all of these things, and the current government in India is becoming much more nationalist kind of foreign policy to respond to Xi Jinping's aggressive posture. So we see a class of ideas, class of national interest, class of leadership, which is making China-India relations much more tense and conflict-oriented.
Thanks, Jagannath. That's such a great point, and I think it's an area that's been a concern, right? Is that shift in Chinese thinking about national security. And one thing, obviously, Joel said the posture's not there or anything like that, but I think about a situation where if Xi Jinping was confronting a major domestic legitimacy challenge, he might look for some sort of a foreign policy victory. And because a confrontation with India doesn't directly involve the United States, there may be lower risks in pushing the envelope in the Himalayas. Now this is kind of hypothesizing, looking into the crystal ball a little bit. There is one sort of last party in the room, and it's good Sudha's here, that I think we should touch on, right? We know that this is not simply a bilateral situation. There is another nuclear power involved, which is, of course, Pakistan, right? Sudha, can you, and Jagannath and Joel as well, if maybe we could talk just briefly about that. And of course, We saw Imran Khan's very ill-fated visit to Moscow last week. What is the role of Pakistan in all this?
Well, the thing is, with increasing tensions between India and China, that works well for Pakistan. With regard to Russia, I think Imran Khan, I'd read somewhere that Imran Khan's visit to Russia really was, it was scheduled much earlier, and there was no way he could really cancel it without needlessly drawing Russian ire, given their improving relations. I see Pakistan-China relations, Pakistan-Russia relations also improving in the coming years. So I think India needs to really plan for multiple fronts and multiple contingencies.
Yes, I think, John, I'll just substantiate Sudha's point by saying I think there is clearly a Pakistan angle into the India-China boundary dispute. We know for a fact that if we review the last 3 or 4 decades Chinese position on Kashmir, it has always been zigzag. It has always been fluctuating. The Chinese have said that they take a neutral position, but they have time and again been affiliated and aligned with Pakistan to support the Kashmir problem, the Kashmir issue in favor of Pakistan. But I think here the one point I would like to make is that, in fact, I wrote a piece in Jamestown Foundation's China Brief about Himalayan Quad. There is a quad systematically emerging in the Himalayan regions. And this quad is not Indo-Pacific Quad. This is a China-oriented, China-dominated quad, China-led quad. China, Nepal, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And with all of these countries, China is trying to strengthen its relationship, be it on trade and economy, be it on the security issues, particularly factoring the Himalayan Valley issues, and particularly try to corner India on different issues. So there is definitely a Pakistan angle to China in the boundary dispute. We should not rule out. But more than the boundary dispute, I think the Chinese are using systematically Pakistan to their own advantage. I don't know how long they would be with Pakistan, but at some point in history, in the future, they will disband Pakistan and probably give up the relationship with Pakistan once they try to achieve their objectives vis-a-vis India.
Just very concisely, I would rate Pakistan certainly in the top 5 of China's defense partners alongside Russia and just 1 or 2 others in terms of both the arms exports, strategic coordination and cooperation on various other issues. And another one of the minilateral settings, certainly is in terms of counterterrorism cooperation. And as the Afghan issue has once again reared its head, this becomes important as well. But I did want to return to an earlier point, John, that you made about sort of diversionary conflict, and also tying into Jagannath's point about sort of nationalism as a driver of Chinese foreign policy. I mean, these are important things to consider. China doesn't really have a track record of diversionary war. They tend to, in the context of domestic crises, kind of hunker down and try not to open up too many different conflicts, fearing that they can only juggle too many problems at once. And so if there were a diversion, I would expect them to try to maintain fairly tight control over the escalation. They don't want a domestic and a foreign crisis at the same time. At least historically that's been the case. But I completely agree with what Jagannath mentioned in terms of nationalism being more important now. And this gets to your question, John, about explaining why China's been less willing to deal with border issues today than it was back in the 1990s and early 2000s. This is an important factor, especially as sort of China's economy and economic growth hit fairly significant headwinds. The CCP has to be able to justify its continued rule somehow. And if it's not in sustained high-level double-digit growth, then it has to be in terms of defending national territorial interests. This is particularly relevant, of course, to the Taiwan problem, but is relevant to every border dispute that they face. And so, especially if there is a perceived provocation, they have to be able to be seen to be doing something, or else risk atrophying that particular increasingly important domestic leg of their domestic legitimacy. And so I don't see that particular factor declining in importance, especially after the Party Congress, and especially as the economy continues to run into troubles going forward. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Joel. I think that's a good point to maybe leave us on. I guess, does anyone have any last kind of interjections, any kind of, I know it's been a sort of an unprecedented week for global geopolitics. So I know we've got such great experts here. I don't know if anyone has any final points to leave our audience with, or if we can kind of leave it on Joel's point, which is, I think, spot on and also somewhat worrisome.
I think if there are no questions, just a couple of points I would like to mention, John. And I think when Trump was the president, there was a statement whether US can act as a mediator between China and India. Clearly, I don't see a scope for US to play a mediating role between China and India. But I think if we look at the larger canvas, US can emerge as a tripartite peace holder in the regions, and that will open up of a greater context for India, China, US, trilateral in the global context. Because if we have to divert our attention from what is happening on Ukraine, what is happening between China and US, what is happening between India and China, what is happening between Japan and China, and if we try to again go back to the beginning of the 21st century and try to see in a larger canvas, I think still there is a scope, there is a larger scope, in fact, for China, India, and the US to lead the process of global governance and try to have a more tripartite kind of a network and come together and try to address the small issues and look at the global governance issues and take the lead. And I think that is one aspect probably from the US point of view, which needs to be understood, and probably both India and US needs to talk about it before we start talking to the Chinese. I know for a fact that the Chinese will be much more assertive and aggressive in times to come during Xi Jinping's period, but I think this is one aspect probably we should not miss out to discuss at some point in future.
Great. I think that's maybe kind of a hopeful point to leave us on. So I think that's a good way to go out. I want to thank our excellent panelists for joining us today. All three of them have recently written for Jamestown's China Brief. So I strongly encourage you to check out their recent articles on China's military modernization, China-India relations, China-Pakistan relations, all those important matters that we've been discussing today. And Jamestown will continue to closely cover these issues. We'll also be rapidly posting this video to YouTube to share it with people that weren't able to join live today, and I'm sure we'll revisit many of the great points made in this discussion. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and I look forward to future engagements with all of you. Take care.